One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
That's President-elect Donald Trump earlier this year saying he would encourage Russia to do, quote unquote, whatever they want to any NATO member country that does not meet the 2% of GDP target for defense spending. Canada currently does not meet that target, but the Feds did promise this summer to do so by 2032. According to the latest data from NATO, Canada is expected to hit 1.3% of GDP on defense spending this year. The Fed's updated defense policy released back in April says that Canada will hit 1.76% of GDP by the end of the decade. I spoke to Trump's former ambassador to Canada, Kelly Craft, this week, who was insistent Canada can do better, and Trump will expect that.
I think it's really important that Canadians understand a strong military is your way of deterrence, especially in the Arctic. I mean, you no longer just have a threat from Eastern Europe, from that area. You have Russia and China in the Arctic. And I think Russia and China are not going to wait until 2032, as your prime minister has made the statement that he would have the 2% of the GDP by 2032. They're not going to wait. This is a real threat.
Here to talk more about all of that is retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie, also, of course, a former member of the federal government under Justin Trudeau, who served as a point person actually on the U.S.-Canada relationship during the first Trump term. And former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder, is with us as well. Hi to both of you. Thank you very much for making the time. General Leslie, I'll start with you. I was thinking today of when you were that point person and all the work that you did, on behalf of the government when it came to NAFTA and the ups and downs of all of that. And I wondered from your perspective, based on that experience, living through Trump's first administration, how seriously we should take it that, his closest Canada envoy during those years is so directly telling us to speed up our spending on defense.
It's not only the Americans who are telling us this, and not only the president-designate and the former ambassador, Kelly. It's the entirety of NATO is telling us the same thing. We're the world's 10th largest economy, but we can't seem to get our act together to actually produce usable defense output at a time when our friends and allies need it most. And let's not forget, we're part of an alliance so that they'll come to our assistance if we need it. We go to theirs if they do. And we've fallen short, and we've been caught flat-footed.
Ambassador Daalder, I wanted to ask you something similar. I mean, there's so much to unpack when it comes to Trump's rhetoric that I think it becomes easy to dismiss some things, particularly where NATO is concerned, because he's been very dismissive of the alliance at times. He said things like the clip we played. But the former ambassador, Kelly Craft, she was very, very serious in, two separate interviews, for example, that's the number one priority for Donald Trump when it comes to our relationship with Canada. In your view, how serious will it be for this country that we do have to speed up defense spending?
So I'm actually not clear that this is the number one priority for Donald Trump, but it should be the number one priority for Canada. And I think fundamentally, this is not an issue about Donald Trump. Joe Biden has told Canadians repeatedly that they needed to spend more on defense. Barack Obama told Canadians they repeatedly. He did so in the Canadian Parliament. This is not because the United States somehow desires and thinks it's important that you spend more on defense. It's that Canada needs to spend more on defense. Most importantly, because it's a member of an alliance that has agreed, Canada agreed, to spend 2% of GDP in 2024, not 2032, 2024. That's this year. Canada's failure to do that it makes it an outlier in this alliance, an outlier on the side that Canada normally wouldn't be an outlier. Canada has obligations, not to the United States, not to Donald Trump, but to 30 other NATO members, and it is failing in those applications. I think it is wrong to think that this has anything to do with Donald Trump. It has everything to do with your own responsibilities as a member of the alliance, and frankly, given the threats, and I think Ambassador Craft was right, given the threats that you face in the Arctic and other places, spending more on defense, you don't do as a favor to others, you do it because it's important for your own national security.
I think the reason, General Leslie, that I bring it up in the context of Donald Trump is because it's also, by Kelly Craft, for example, being explicitly tied to the economic relationship, which is at the forefront given the threat of tariffs and NATO. And to Ambassador Deldo's point, he's not the first person, or that people associated with Trump are not the first people to associate our economic relationship with defense spending. But I guess I wonder how, from your perspective, realistic you think it is that Canada complies with this, even though the threat of something punitive in the economic realm is there. It's also very expensive to even meet the target by 2032. That's what the government will certainly tell us.
Right. I believe that the federal government has entered sort of a whining, an unpleasant stage in its evolution, where they're now whining that they can't meet that which they've been promising to do since 2014. And the current prime minister has promised this every year he's been in power. And now suddenly in 2023, he realizes, good heavens, what follows 2024? I think we owe NATO some money in terms of investment in our defense capabilities, which we have not done. Right now, Canada is struggling to maintain 2,500 troops, air, land, and sea overseas. Our frigates are older than the sailors which sail them. We can only afford to have one modest-sized warship as our contributions to the entirety of the Pacific region. Our Arctic is undefended. We have 300 armed forces administrators. We've got about 1,600 rangers armed with a rifle and a skidoo, and their job is not to deter, it's to observe and report. Russia has between 25 to 35,000 troops in their Arctic Circle, and the Americans, bless them, have 22,000 superbly trained, well-equipped people in Alaska, their Arctic, who are actually defending us. And the Americans, predating Donald Trump, are sick and tired of us not paying our fair share.
Ambassador Daalder, as you, yeah, go ahead, go right ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add to this. I think the reality is that Donald Trump actually is not particularly interested in Canada spending more on defense because he's not particularly interested in alliances. The reason that Canada needs to get serious about defense and needs to get serious about defense together with its European and other allies is because the Trump administration, this particular Trump administration, is going to be no friend of NATO. It's going to be no friend of alliances. The idea that you can rely on the United States, what is the 22,000 troops in Alaska, or indeed the 100,000 troops in Europe, to be there to defend the interests of the Europeans, which I happen to believe are also American interests, but I don't think Donald Trump believes that. He believes that Europe should be defended by Europeans. He probably believes that Canada should be defended by Canadians, just as he thinks Americans should be defended by America. Under those circumstances, the era on which Europeans and Canada have relied on the United States as the security guarantor, and in fact the force that will defend them, that era is coming to a close. That's the reality. And if Canada says we cannot afford 2% of GDP to spend on defense, well, can you afford to keep country? Because that's what you're really talking about, given the threats that we're facing, and the reality that the United States can no longer be counted on as an ally. So under those circumstances, not just what NATO needs, it's not just what Canada, what the threats are, it's what Canada needs to do.
I think General Leslie wants to jump in on that point too. Go ahead.
I would just like to build on the whole idea of strategic risk management. And what we're facing is an unparalleled immersion of threats, not the least of which Russia, China, Iran, and a variety of other dictatorships, all of whom seem to be coalescing around the idea that the rule of law no longer holds true. The President of the United States, their first job is to take care of America. And then after that, it's discretionary. There's every instance to believe that we should prepare for the case where the United States starts to withdraw from international commitments in terms of blood and treasure assigned to defend others. And I believe the current government has made the reprehensible error, despite evidence that could have guided them if they'd been willing to listen, to invest in our defense so that we have our defense capability, which we can use to help others should we choose to do so, to take care of ourselves. Because the era of relying on the United States to defend us in the face of all adversaries may be over.
I just have time for one quick question for Ambassador Daalder. The government will say, and I posed part of it already, how expensive it is, that there are a myriad of other priorities, and that they have increased spending, or at least the allotment of defense dollars, significantly since they came into office. Of course, that still puts that target out till 2032. What would you say to respond to that?
So the government faces the same problem that every other government faces. Canada is hardly the only country that has competing financial interests, whether it is social, pensions, health, name it. Every government has that. And yet somehow every government, or at least all the major governments in Europe, have been able to get to the 2%, even though they face similar backlogs of underinvestment. That includes Germany, which is this year spending 2% of GDP because it promised to do so. It says in 2014, after Russia first invaded and seized Crimea, that we would reach 2% by GDP by 2024. Canada signed on to that agreement. It had 10 years to figure out how to get there. And to say in 2023, sorry, we need another 9 years, isn't good enough. The reality is it's not about how you spend it, it's that your security is being eroded in a way that will not benefit the Canadian people. If your security is eroded, then your health care and everything else will fall by the wayside too. It is job one of the government, and this government has not done what it promised to do, and it needs to do that. Not because the U.S. asks it, not because NATO asks it, but because it thinks and said that that was important, and it agreed to it.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. I appreciate both of you making the time for the conversation tonight. Retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie and former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder.